Okay, so welcome to the Brattleboro Democracy Forum. Formerly at the Strolling of the Heifers on the first Monday of the month, now on Zoom. We plan to continue our regular monthly meetings on Zoom, and we need people to present at our meetings. Please contact me, Woody Bernhard, 802-464-3154. Thank you very much. I want to start out by saying that to me, the ideal of democracy is the most beautiful example of human love that we will ever see. Democracy is definitely worth working for. If you're going to make a lot of noise, please mute yourself. If you're going to unwrap a snack, and if your dog is going to bark or whatever, please mute yourself. I do miss having us all in one room together where we don't have to figure out how to talk to each other. But this is definitely worth doing, and I'm looking forward to the meeting. Please bear with us. The next meeting will be on Monday, November 22nd on Zoom. November 2nd, I'm sorry. Today, I'm pleased to welcome Brattleboro resident Tim Kipp. Tim is a retired history and political science teacher of 39 years, and he has been a political activist since the 1960s. The subject of Tim's talk today is Whither the United States, the Health of Democracy. Tim says that identifying and examining historical flaws provides focal points for restructuring our system in order to build real democracy. So Tim, tell us how you see the meeting working, and thank you for being here. Take it away. I'm looking forward to it.
Thanks, Woody. It's good to be here,
Thank you.
even through all of this this electronic jungle.
Yes.
We are in an extraordinary time in our history. I hate to use the word unprecedented and unique. I seem to be using that over and over again in the last 3 or 4 years for obvious reasons. But now more than ever, we have this the rising tide of authoritarianism under the Trump regime. We have an exciting reckoning with race relations and racial justice. We have the economic collapse, and then layered on all of that, of course, is we have the pandemic. All of this has led to I would say the broadest, most vigorous public examination of what our political or our governing system actually is and how effective it is. We are seriously calling into question how healthy is our democracy. Well, what I would like to do in this presentation and a few others down the road is to examine some of the major structures of our system and look at it and see if, in fact, what the status of our democracy is. It was the playwright Bertolt Brecht that said, "Art is not a mirror that reflects society, but it is a hammer with which to shape society." I look at history the same way. History can be a tool or a weapon to shape society. And I'm hoping by my studying this and passing it on, it will raise people's consciousness about what kind of society we really live in. My teaching career, I have taught both about the country's strengths, but also my teaching has been animated, I would say mostly animated by the critical perspectives of progressive thinkers and actors from the revolutionary days of Tom Paine to the present. The great radical educator Paulo Freire, who was very influential in my own pedagogy, calls this an education for a critical consciousness. So social change, according to Freire and to many others who have followed in his footsteps, that social change comes from a critical analysis. So we have to have that critical analysis. What was the bumper sticker? It said, if you're not pissed off, you're not paying attention. This presentation will explore the fundamental weaknesses of our political economy. We will identify these historical flaws, as Woody mentioned, and I'm going to do this in 3 parts. First, I want to talk a little bit about analysis, the competing schools or methods of political and historical analysis. I'll do that briefly. And then I want to go in my second part, as I want to talk about what is democracy and what I would describe as real democracy. And the last part and the bulk of the presentation will be on how does our economic system of capitalism actually work to undermine democracy. The structure and the function of capitalism, I think, is antithetical to real democracy. So let me start with an overview, a quick overview of the 2 basic schools of political analysis. And they are the pluralist school and then the power elite school, or the structural school of thought. History is made by the intersection of individuals and their economic and political environments, which in turn command significant influence in shaping human behaviors. Psychologists call this behaviorism. Radical academics call this a structural or power elite analysis. The more conventional, popular, mainstream analysis is called pluralism. And this analysis, which is mainly taught in colleges and in high school and in graduate school, relies on assumptions that our governing system is shaped by multiple competing forces in more or less democratic arrangements. And I'll go into more of that as we go along. These forces include individuals and groups and these leaders, their strengths and their weaknesses, their styles and their personalities. While these are important factors in deciphering the past, there is more to understanding the motions of history than this pluralist idea. Pluralism in my view, pluralism can confuse cause with symptoms, correlation with causation, all the while ignoring the root reasons for actions and behaviors. Pluralism, and this is where I have the largest amount of disagreement with, pluralism ignores the organic relationship between the political system and our economic system. I don't think you can study the political system without understanding the economic system, or it's really the economic system is the ocean that the political system swims in. The power elite or structural approach asks different questions. It asks, first of all, what is the architecture in which these leaders actually function? How does a system's operating rules, simplicit ideologies, and wider assumptions influence this array of decisions? This analytical approach, in my view, tries to get at the root of cause and effect. Let me illustrate. For instance, take the Trump presidency. Why, please take it. While it may be satisfying to describe Trump as an idiotic, vulgar, narcissistic, infantile autocrat who has turned politics into burlesque, such descriptions, while satisfying, and are really no more than hand-wringing over, or doing such as hand-wringing over Trump's daily assaults on decency and democracy. But all of this really only rises to the level of a liberal complaint that indicts Trump and the Republican enablers. But this perspective seldom suggests that Trump may be a symptom of a larger problem of the failing political economy. So he is a symptom and not necessarily just an actor. According to the political scientist and activist Michael Parenti, quote, most events in our history result from broader configurations of power, wealth, and institutions that are structured in dominant political organizations, in the economy, and in society. According to Parenti, the social order does not operate like some mystical abstract entity. Rather, it is shaped and directed by the people who deliberately pursue certain goals that will expand and secure their economic and political power. So here, and I'm concluding this section, here I am not advocating for a rejection of the pluralist school, but rather for an inclusion of the power-latent structural school, because I think that would lends us more understanding of our governing system and our history. Let me go to now the second section, having to do with what is democracy. And here I've developed an understanding over time that goes well beyond the conventional pluralist definitions that you find in high school and college textbooks.
Tim, I was wondering if you wanted to advance your materials for us to view. Are we supposed to be
Yes,
looking at?
sorry. I was so enamored of my words that I just forgot about it. Yeah.
Thanks.
Okay. Yes, that's right. I'm glad I'm not chewing gum. Okay, so I've done that. All right, now I'm moving. Yes, sorry. Coming right along here. All right, now. So what? Well, I'm going to try to do this well. So I'm going to give a more expansive definition of democracy. Okay, and something that goes well beyond the what I call the limitations of the pluralist school. This definition that I'm talking about. Well, why did I get so big here? Am I real big on your screen?
You need to reshare your screen if you opened up a new Word document.
All right. All right. Okay. This definition demands a higher standard for the role of government. So if we're asking more of democracy, we want more up from democracy. It is the government and the forces that shape our society that need to respond to that. Democracy in the conventional sense, in the pluralist senses, we talk about lawmaking, we talk about voting, and certainly very important. I don't want to give the impression that I don't think it's important. Obviously it is, but there's more to it than that. There's much more to this process. So democracy is not just political. Democracy is not a noun. Real democracy, in my view, is a continuum, a never-ending process that must perpetually be defended and nurtured. For the forces out there that threaten democracy are constantly at work. We see it on a daily basis now in the Trump regime. And these forces are embodied in the nature and the process of our economic system, the economic system of capitalism. So our system itself is fighting against the values and the ideals and the beauty, as Woody calls it, of democracy. These threats not only come from corrupt and greedy people, and that's where pluralism would fall on this, but they come from the institutions themselves, the institutions that people create that are the structure that will threaten, in my view, threaten democracy. Structural weaknesses in the system itself can undermine democracy, regardless of whether the actors are good or bad. Real democracy happens, yes, in the legislative bodies, in the voting booths, and in the economic lives of us all. In the economic lives of us all. Real democracy is the equal access for all people to the power that influences our economic and political lives. Dun, dun, dun. Now I'm going to try to get to, oops, moving this along. Come on. in the wrong way. As a another component to this that the pluralism never talks about is that real democracy happens at work. It should happen at work. There, I finally found it. Where workers have a fair share of the fruits of their labor and control over their work process. Real democracy recognizes that private property does not give license to exploit workers for higher profits. Real democracy recognizes that where you find political power, you find economic power, and of course, vice versa. Karl Marx, who said that first. Real democracy does not conflate democracy with capitalism. It does not confuse a meaningless array of abundance of material goods with the idea of freedom. And that's a classic, in my view, of what this society does and our political economy does. Real democracy enables all people access to the security of housing, unemployment, health, education, and leisure. Real democracy happens when there is no poverty, no hunger, and racial and class inequalities. Alexis de Tocqueville in 1831, in his book Democracy in America, observed this after his months of travel on the eastern coast of the United States. The surface of the American society is covered with a layer of democratic paint. So let me conclude this section with a reiteration and a definition that I think is a more honest and holistic definition of democracy. Democracy is a system in perpetual motion where the people have relatively equal access to economic and political power. Economic and political. And again, I can't emphasize it enough. Economic power is an essential component to democracy, as our economic lives actually supersede our political lives. We're swirling around more in our economic lives than we are in our political lives. Let me now go to the last and the most comprehensive of this presentation, and that is how the relationship between capitalism, our economic system, and democracy. My thesis, again, is going to be that the economic system of capitalism undermines our system of democracy. All right, let me widen this a bit. Contrary to founding myths, this country was not indeed created on the ideas of freedom and religious liberty. Look at Jamestown, 1619, and Plymouth in 1620. These were fundamentally economic enterprises built on colonization and exploitation. Jamestown was a product of the first global corporation in existence that led the way for the subsequent years and generations, the British East India Company. And there they sought profits via imperial control of natives and their lands. If you turn to the Puritans in Massachusetts, religious differences and intolerance towards others in England and Holland ultimately led the Puritans to colonize in Massachusetts. We always hear of it, of course, as the struggle for religious freedom. And in fact, they were exercising religious intolerance. Prior to the arrival of the Puritans, as early as 1605, English explorer George Weymouth, following the lead of the Spanish, set out to kidnap and enslave the Wampanoag natives in this region. The Puritans followed the lead of Weymouth, and they continued to enslave natives, and then added to it, they also enslaved Africans. We don't hear much about that, but it indeed happened. The Puritans' religious intolerance led them to expel the likes of Roger Williams and others, such as Anne Hutchinson, from the colony. In an interesting footnote to history, Thomas Jefferson, in one of the original drafts of the Declaration of Independence, in a grand act of hypocrisy and of blaming the victim, wrote, quote, that slaves who rebelled for their freedom were a threat to the revolution and to independence. So he was blaming the people enslaved for wanting to be free. My. So, and let me move on to argue that corporate capitalism is fundamentally incompatible with real democracy. I think it's an honest appraisal to say that our economy is a neo-feudal system based on authoritarian structures, decision-making, and a hierarchical set of human relations. There's a boss, and then everyone else follows. And that goes right through both our economic and our political system. As we know from high school and college, corporate capitalism's vital characteristics are, and these are of course venerated daily in this society, the beauty and the power of private property, the engine of profits to move the economy along, competition to keep us honest, and a free market from which the operators, the players can operate. And lastly, a laissez-faire concept overlays all of this, in that the less government regulation of business, the better off the society will be, according to the apologists and the doctrinal system that prevails today. Each of these can function all of these can function in very undemocratic ways, and they can actually work to counter the ideas of cooperation, of human cooperation, and collective responsibility for public good. This system encourages placing the individual over the group, and it promotes an atomized me first ethos. Again, we see this playing out in brutal forms to this day. Such a value system rewards selfish impulses, and that become indeed antagonistic to democracy. Our political economy has evolved, I believe, into an oligarchic plutocracy system. We are experiencing a process, and it's just been going on for a number of decades, more than we've seen in recent times, of de-democratization. We are going through a process of de-democratization. Let me explore a little bit more on the dynamics of capitalism. The renowned economist Sam Bowles described in his one of his earlier works, Understanding Capitalism, that the system it's an odd race. Capitalism is this odd race. There is no beginning, there's no end. A competitor can join at any time in the race, or can fall off at any time, fall off the race or out of the race. He describes it as a bicycle theory of capitalism, that capitalism only works if it's in motion, if it's moving forward, and forward can be defined based upon your own values. So it's a grow or die situation that propels the system. Here, the imperatives, those necessary elements of capitalism, the competition, profit, the market, and so forth, require perpetual expansion. Here, the modes of production have to perpetually expand, or you're going to lose the competitive race. That reality to expand leads to the exploitation of workers and the natural resources. And I should include here the exploitation that leads to imperialism. Let me try to do something here. All right. Bowles, if you're interested in this, Bowles, Sam Bowles, David Harvey, and Marx himself, among many others, have written extensively on this. It's always easier to read the interpreters of Marx than to read Marx himself, in my view. Under excuse me, under capitalism, labor is regarded as an expense, within the private property concept. An owner treats workers, therefore, as just another form of property. That's quite a way of doing business. Therefore, the logic and imperatives of capitalism is to maximize production, minimize pay, and minimize benefits. And we certainly have seen that in our society. The internal logic of corporate capitalism requires an acceleration of the exploitation of labor and natural resources. For instance, we know that workers today have little or no due process rights under the 5th and 14th Amendment. We know of at-will employment. Many states, a majority of states, are at-will employment states. For those who don't know, that is a worker can be let go, fired for no reason whatsoever. Unless, of course, they're protected by a union. And I'll bring up that later. Workers have little or no privacy rights under the 4th Amendment. Workers have little or no workplace governance. They don't have the ability to control how they do their labor. Workers have little or no power over compensation, benefits, or working conditions. And they don't have free speech rights in their place of employment. Ultimately, workers in our society do not gain the real fruits of their labor. They cannot, they don't under this system. Marxists wrote about how important work was to an individual. He said that work was the most defining life activity. It creates identity and worth. Now he's writing this in the mid 19th century, so it has its limitations from understanding of what we know about human behavior today. However, I think the fundamental assumptions or premises are strong and relevant today. So if we have a dehumanized work place, we create, according to Marx and others, Erich Fromm writes about this, it creates an alienation of the worker from themselves and society. And it's that alienation, that discontent, that leads to destructive antisocial behaviors, drug use, violence, and so forth. Such dehumanization can also be seen in how capitalism can commodify people, make them into brands. They're profit machines. That's what they're looked on. And if you look at the celebrity system in our society, sports and actors and musicians, so forth, they can be and are turned into commodities, whether they want to be or not. Aiding and abetting this whole system is our judicial process, from the Supreme Court down to other the federal district courts and the like. Courts have ruled historically overwhelmingly in favor of corporate property rights over human rights from the 19th century to this day. A few notable examples that help define the course and direction of this country. The 1857 Dred Scott decision, where Roger B. Taney declared that slaves are not human beings. We know the implications of that. In 1876, a little known one, certainly publicly, Supreme Court case, U.S. versus Cruikshank, which went a great way towards weakening the 14th Amendment just a few years after the 14th was passed in 1868. And what it did was it undermined the protections of the 14th Amendment for Blacks as citizens of the United States. A Supreme Court decision that's gotten a little more attention these days is 1886, the Santa Clara versus Southern Pacific Railroad, where they determined in an indirect way that corporations are in fact people and enjoy the same protections as people do, so corporate protection. 1896, a well-known notorious decision of Plessy versus Ferguson, legalized segregation up until the 50s and 60s, 1950s and 60s. Coming closer to our time, from 1976 to 2014, conservative Supreme Court passed a series of crucial, and I would say egregious, campaign finance laws. The Buckley decision in 76, Citizens United in 2010, and the McCutcheon decision soon after that, 2013, which ends both individual and corporate limits on campaign spending. So the floodgates, excuse me, are opened, and and money in politics becomes even more and more important and dominant. The wealthy get to vote or have a higher rate of influence in the voting process because their interests can be much more easily represented through campaign financing and through advertising. In 2018, another decision in the Roberts Court, the Shelby versus Holder, declared that the Voting Rights Act of 1965, which is, I believe, one of the most positive, powerful instruments of expanding democracy in our society. Well, that decision, the Shelby versus Holder, was undermined by the ruling that said that the United States government could not regulate what states were doing in terms of access to the ballot. Where since 65 it had been the purview of the government to protect people's rights when they were being discriminated against at the ballot box. And John Roberts, the Chief Justice, said at the time when Shelby was ruled upon that, quote, voter discrimination is largely a thing of the past. Interesting. And there are countless examples throughout our history of court rulings in favor of property over people. What I see in our economic system is a core major contradiction. The pluralists and conservatives value the idea of laissez-faire, that the less government, as I mentioned before, and this is well known, less government is the better government, and we should not interfere with the operations of businesses. Let those businesses run free, and they will provide us with a higher standard of living, with more employment and the like. Capitalism extols the virtues and necessity of the free market. This near-religious mantra praises government deregulation of business. Well, in reality, capitalism actually requires more government interference, not less. Capitalism demands more if you're to have a modicum of decency within the society. And here's why. Because of the myriad of corporate abuses on humans, on the political system, and the environment coming from corporations, it is those abuses that demand an increase in the size and the role of government, because capitalism has failed to meet basic needs of human beings. So the economic system's failures have to be compensated for to a certain degree by the government. The classic example, of course, is the New Deal under Franklin Roosevelt in the 1930s and Lyndon Johnson's era of the Great Society in the 1960s. Those, I would say, are high water marks for the fight for decency and a struggle for democracy that would include everybody in society. They all had their severe limitations, but there were notable efforts at improving people's lives. Along these lines is the concept of market failure and capital strike. Market failure means that certain areas businesses will refuse to invest in because they can't make enough profit. So why do we have problems with public housing, or little of it? Why is job training not available as much as it should be? Environmental protection, mass transit, and the like are not invested in because businesses determine they can put their dollars, if they want to put it in or not, put their dollars elsewhere where they can get a quicker, faster, higher rate of return. And the same is true with something called capital strike, where capital from the corporations actually goes unused. They will sit on it instead of investing it, either in their own businesses or elsewhere. So the money or the capital is hoarded until better profit possibilities. All, again, working for the benefit of that sector, the elite sector of society, to the detriment of the vast majority of people in America. So capitalism, in my view, aggregates power, both economic and political, into fewer and fewer hands. And this concentration of influence undermines our system of democracy. Okay, let me put up here what I call the cycle of influence. It's something I put together in trying to have students understand this in a summary form of what capitalism does to a democrat or to a political system. So this cycle of influence, it starts like this. Corporate capitalism, which we have today, as we know, causes an increase in concentration of economic power. And I'm making reference to that. And that causes an increase in the concentration of political power to the elites, and which in turn causes a government to create a government because of their political power, create a government to serve the interests of the elites first and foremost. The most vivid example would be the class makeup of the House and Senate and the interests and the values that they legislate for. I've always said, I used to say to my students, I said, imagine that we didn't have millionaires and billionaires running Congress, but rather we had working class people in Congress. We had the homeless, we had the poor, that they made up the bulk of the representatives in Congress. What would the laws look like? What would society values be promoted with that, from that perspective? So if you take the wealthy, you don't have to eliminate the wealthy in a legislative process, but let's have a fair balance of who our society is and how that can be represented in a legislative body. And you actually may get a more democratic outcome. Going on. The government will serve the interests of the elites, and first and foremost, which causes rules to continue to deregulate the system, weaken public education and healthcare, destroy unions, expand the military budget, and I could talk about that. I think I will leave that to a later time. It can destroy legislation that will destroy social programs and deny climate change. Which this can lead to the de-democratization of our society, and which leads to a plutocracy and an oligarchy, ruled by the few and ruled by the wealthy. And once we get to that stage, I don't know what we're going to look at. I don't know. When I put this together, I thought of an expression that I am happy to share with you, and that is, money is like manure. It only works when it's spread around. Well, corporations don't spread it around very much these days, and if they do, it's only for their benefit. So corporate capitalism in and of itself fosters a whole system of inequality. We have the most unequal society on earth in regards to, compared to industrialized societies. If you look at European countries in particular, that our society, in the quote advanced industrial society, we are the most unequal, even though we are the richest society on earth. Capitalism tends to lift up some sectors. This is Carl Pugliani in his book, The Great Transformation. He calls this a two-nation effect. Capitalism tends to lift up some sectors of society while degrading other sectors. An old crusty socialist neighbor of mine years ago used to refer to this as the horse and sparrow economy, the horse and sparrow economy, whereby the horses get the good grain, get the good feed, and then when they leave their deposits on the road, the sparrows come down and peck at the deposits. And so, in many ways, I think we are the sparrows in this arrangement. Notice I kept it pretty clean. I didn't want to get too so, for instance, in the 19th century, we had an amazing industrial boom. It was an explosion, but it was a bust for the people of color, or women, or workers, and immigrants, who I call the usual suspects. In 1890, the US became the leading manufacturing country in the world at the expense of workers and the environment. And also, this would accelerate the process of imperialism. The Roaring 20s, great Roaring 20s, but they didn't roar for the usual suspects. Great Depression hit the middle class and the lower classes. The upper classes may have had to drop a maid or a butler, but their fundamental lives remained intact. An interesting period in our history, the post-World War II, 1945 to the 60s, was a rare period when a broader cross-section of society realized economic gains. Now, the pluralists and conservatives would argue that's because of the miracle of laissez-faire, the free market, the invisible hand government leaving business alone so they could expand and offer the abundance of the American society or economy. Well, that isn't quite why this expanded economy did have some broadening impacts. It was not this magic of laissez-faire. Quite the contrary. The gains that were made in this era were achieved because of an increase in the government's role in the economy. Government expanded its role in the economy to help stimulate it. And also, and very important, there was the increase in organized labor. That unions, sadly, actually now, but that in the 1950s, 35% of American workers were organized into unions. Now that doesn't sound like much, but that was the high watermark. That was the high watermark of our union participation. Today, 7 to 9% of industrial labor is organized. Eric Hobsbawm, his Age of Extremes would be a book that I'd recommend regarding this. Also, the works of Kenneth Galbraith would be another one that I would recommend. Let me just say a quick word about gross domestic product. We hear about that all the time. And this to me is a perfect example of a capitalist measure of what a decent society is. That we have historically, and it was John Maynard Keynes in 1940 who came up with this, and he was the liberal economist, that we rely on this measure called gross domestic product as an indicator of economic growth. The value, if you add up all the value of goods and services produced in 1 year, you have a number that shows you whether your economy is expanding or contracting and so forth. As we know, the United States is the largest economy in the world to this day. But if we rely on GDP as a measure, we don't get a complete picture. I think it's a misleading, property biased measure of economic health. Let me give you an example. If a company sets out to produce some product and then ends up being a major polluter in the society, that pollution process, that cleanup process is also measured as a boost or a rise to gross domestic product. So it is negative dynamics that can cause economic activity, even though they're destroying the environment, can be counted as a boon to the gross domestic product. For a more humanistic, more realistic measure of a society's growth and decency would be the Gini Index, which is used by the United Nations for many years, which measures the levels of inequality within a country. And then another one called the Social Progress Index, again used by the United Nations, measures overall quality of life. It takes into account 50 different factors having to do with what is a decent society. So it looks at healthcare, it looks at education and housing and nutrition and so forth. There are 50 different indices that it factors in. Well, the United States doesn't do so well on that. Yes, we are the largest economy, but the United States ranks 28th out of 164 nations, both industrialized and the likes across the world. We are only ranked 28th in terms of social progress index. There are other indices that are out there too, but I think these are two of the most compelling ones. I'm going to skip over the stock market, other than just to make the idea that the stock market is not, or Wall Street is not Main Street. What happens in the stock market these days is really disconnected to what's happening to the real economy and to what's happening to real people in the economy. 40% of the stock market revenues come from abroad. And when the stock market was going up, the 20 million jobs were lost during the early days of the pandemic. I want to talk a little bit more about economic theory and as it relates to our understanding of capitalism. Call it economic magical thinking, the free marketeers versus the supply-siders. I would say meet this great vaudeville team of trickle down and the free market. They always appear on stage together. Since the 1980s, conservatives and many liberals have venerated the power of the trickle-down economic theory. Lower taxes on the wealthy, and they will reinvest and expand the economy. Sound familiar? Sounds like Mr. Reagan. Or the popular expression was, a rising tide will lift all boats. That's still very familiar, really emerging out of the Reagan administration, although it had been around earlier than that, certainly promoted by the likes of Milton Friedman in the Chicago School of Economics. The trickle down, AKA supply side economics, never seems to die as a theory, call it the Dracula theory of economics. And it has been clearly demonstrated by many studies that the trickle-down theory does not work. It simply does not work. Markets aren't free. Wealth does not trickle down. Markets have never been free. And as a result, it's easy to analyze this. Just look at the results. How many people are doing well in our system? How many people are surviving and living stable lives? So I would change. Oh, I would recommend Paul Krugman's Arguing with Zombies as a good book in terms of these competing. Not these prevailing economic theories. Liberals and conservatives have historically and willfully conflated the free market with the concept of freedom. This kills me. It always bothers me. So as such, they substitute or confuse this freedom with democracy. Free to choose among a dazzling array of material goods. Well, I ask, how many choices or options of toilet paper do I need from my co-op to make myself feel free? Conservatives have argued that by leaving the markets alone, and if we want to change human behavior, we should incorporate market incentives, dollars and cents motivation, in order to make people change their behaviors. Now, Sam Bowles, who I've referenced before in his book written in 2016, The Moral Economy, dives into that directly. And in his extensive study, he demonstrates that non-governmental market incentives, as the free market tiers would like to have it, do not work to change corporate or individual behaviors for the betterment of society. Bowles continues and concludes that only vigorous government regulation can suppress corporate depredations. As Bowles says, markets have evolved into these moral free zones, as self-interest remains the orthodoxy for capital development. He goes on, avarice repackaged as self-interest was tamed and transformed from a moral failing to just another kind of motive, like a taste for ice cream. Getting entirely self-regarding or greedy people to reliably act as if they cared about the effects of their actions on others has long eluded jurists and policymakers, our politicians. So we have to continue asking, for whom this system is working. For whom is this system working? Well, ask the 30% plus of workers today who earn at or below a poverty level wages. Ask those who were in the middle class what has happened to them in the last 30 years. Ask the upper classes what has happened to their income and wealth in the past 30 or 40 years. So our system continues at an accelerated rate to aggregate more and more power to a smaller and smaller elite. And that elite exercises extraordinary influence over the electoral, legislative, judicial, mass media, and cultural processes. I want to talk a little bit about how the United States has what is known as a caste system, not class, but caste system. And this is based upon the work of Isabel Wilkerson, her latest book just published called Caste. And it is, I think, a very compelling study we can understand what inequality in the United States is like and why it has persisted from the days of the revolution. or prior to that even. The United States is built on a caste system, which is a rigid hierarchy of human rankings. And that ranking, it puts whites at the top and people of color at the bottom. No big surprise. So appearance or color is the basis of this caste system. And caste, according to Wilkerson, is deeper and more immutable than race and class. Caste is the infrastructure upon which racial divisions are constructed. Or as she says, and I love her conceptions, caste is the bones and racism is the skin. She also makes analogy to the building of a house. So caste is fixed and rigid, caste is fixed and rigid, and race is more fluid and subject to redefinition. Writing in the 1940s, Ashley Montagu, the thinker and philosopher, said that, quote, when we speak of the race problem in America, what we really mean is the caste system. For instance, take a wealthy Black PhD from a leading university. This society will still ultimately consider this person as being inferior. And we've seen this in terms of, well, the idea of driving while Black, and many other examples of a Black person, no matter what their social status was, being immediately assumed to be lawbreakers and dangerous to society. But where did this caste system come from? According to Wilkerson, it was a divine declaration. Ah, yes, coming from the sources of all truth, right? The Bible. The Old Testament story, the story of Noah, where they will declare that whites, the Caucasians, are naturally, of course, the superior race. So this hierarchy, according to Wilkerson, of caste predates race as a concept. And so you're seeing the formation of a caste as early as the 1620s in colonial Virginia. And according to Wilkerson, the system of this caste system developed to satisfy European hunger for the cheapest, most pliant labor to extract the most wealth. Racism, the cultural fabrication of human differences, emerges from the caste system to bolster the ideological rationale for slavery. And I would argue that ideological rationale was very important in order to make slavery, quote, work for the slave owners. You needed a gun to prop up the slave system, but you also needed an idea, and an idea of superiority. And if you could connect that idea to a religion, better yet, more powerful, more undeniable. According to anthropologists Audrey and Brian Smedley, quote, the English in North America developed the most rigid exclusionary form of race ideology that we really are in the throes of to this day. So what you have then, I believe, capitalism and caste are in symbiosis. They mutually benefit. They're mutual beneficiaries. Thus, capitalism enables economic growth based on exploitation, on inequality of the lower castes. Capitalism, the caste system, and slavery, I believe, are the foundation of our national development, both in the North and the South. Contrary to popular conceptions, the North's economy was deeply integrated into the Southern slave economy, and it was that slave economy that propelled the United States. So if you remove slavery from the equation, Northern economy would not look the way it did during this time of the rise of our economic system prior to the Civil War. I would commend to you the works of Manning Marable and Herbert Actecker if you are interested in looking into that topic more thoroughly. As a vivid example, and I will close this part of the discussion with a vivid example of the prevailing and persistence, prevailing nature and the persistence of our caste system in America really showed up in the New York Times in September, a fascinating chart about who has power, what sectors of our society have power. And so let me just read a few of these things. First of all, the premise, not the premise, but the reality is that 40% of the US population are non-white today. 40% are non-white. And by 2045, it's estimated that the whites will be the minority in the American society. So who has the dominant power within the society? This is not going to come as a surprise, but it's very graphic. So the top of the top 8 military leaders, 1 is a person of color. Of all of the TV and Hollywood moguls, 3 of the 25 top ones are people of color. Governors, 3 out of 50. Supreme Court, 3 out of 9. Major news organizations, only 3 people of color out of the top 15. Leading magazines, 0 of the 10 leading magazines. University presidents, only 1 in 25 of the top universities. The Senate, 9 out of 100. The House, which is probably the best representation, which is obviously a little bit pause for optimism. 112 people of color out of 431. There are 4 seats that are unfilled right now. In pro sports world, 6 are people of color out of 99 of the top CEOs. Music producers, 2 out of 14. Book publishing, 0 out of 5. And the top CEOs, only 6 are people of color out of the top 25. So without doubt, the caste system still holds in America. Okay. I want to finish up with this. What are the consequences? I want to ask the question. So what of all the consequences of this inequality and the power of capitalism within our society? So let me just, I'm going to just highlight a few of the things, and I've got a list of I don't know, 30 different indices showing of our inequality. I'm not going to go through them all. If I was teaching this, I would hand this out and have the kids or students look it over, and we would discuss the importance of this. So 30%, as I've mentioned, the workers earn below poverty income. 30%. CEO pay is outrageous. A Walmart employee earning $20,000 a year would have to work more than 1,000 years to earn what the CEO, Doug McMillon, earns in 1 year. And he earns $22.2 million a year. Race, gender, and income gap. In 2016, women's median weekly earnings were lower than men's. For every dollar a man made, a woman made 81 cents, almost 82 cents. The wage gap between Black and white workers is worse today than it was in 1979. The top 1% income has increased 4 times faster than the bottom 20. Real wages have stagnated over 40 years. The average worker earns 44.5. This is pre-pandemic, by the way. All of this data is pre-pandemic. I should hasten to mention that. The average worker today earns $44,000 a year, which is nearly equal to what they were making in 1979. According to a conservative economist who used to work for Fox News, Tobin Smith, 90% of Americans have had stagnant or declining wages since 1980. 80% of adults report they live from paycheck to paycheck in the richest country in the world. We know the top 1% controls 40% of the wealth. Length of the work week has extended. It took over 100 years to win the 40-hour work week. Blood, people died for it and sweated for it. And in 20 years, from 1980 to 2000, rights are disappearing. Today, 35% of labor work more when laborers, work more than 50 hours a week. These are extraordinary numbers. 45% of the households couldn't come up with $400 for an emergency, according to recent studies. Poverty rates, official poverty rate is anywhere from 12 to 14% in the richest country in the world. Trump's Council of Economic Advisors in 2018 issued a report that concluded that the war on poverty is largely over, and it was a success. This one kills me. 20 to 25% of kids in America grow up in poverty. Millions don't have health insurance, and it's estimated between, and I've read many different figures on this, 30 to 90,000 people die each year for lack of insurance. Infant mortality rate, United States ranks 13th out of the top 19th in terms of infant mortality rate. I could talk about college debt. Non-union protection. 94% of private sector workers and 66% of public sector workers have no union protections. That is extraordinary. We have pursued since the 19th century through the Supreme Court and the judicial system and private militia and state governments and anti-union tactics. We have to be some of the most vicious anti-union. We have to be one of the most anti-union countries in the world. If you look at the rise of the middle class, as I mentioned earlier, look at the strength of unions in the 1950s. Corporate taxes, what a criminal profile this is. In the 1960s, corporations contributed about 35% of the revenue to the federal budget. Today, I've read anywhere from 7 to 10%. Not a bad deal for them. Corporate tax dodging here and offshore. Our tax system as loopholes abound because those who benefit from the tax system are the ones that are writing that system, writing those loopholes. U.S. corporations dodge $90 billion in income taxes per year by going offshore. And they can hide or hold $2.1 trillion in profits offshore. For instance, General Motors offshore's loopholes earned $27.5 billion in profits from 08 to 12 and received a $3.1 billion tax refund. Apple made $74 billion and paid almost nothing in taxes. Middle class is shrinking. We know military spending is high. U.S. spends more than the next top 7 countries combined. And 47% of our disposable income, the budget per year, 47% goes to the military. We are indeed in what Seymour Melman from Columbia determined in the 50s, that we live in a permanent war economy. And that permanent war economy will benefit corporations the most. Eisenhower himself warned of the dangers of the nexus of military, politicians, and corporations in his famous parting speech talking about the military-industrial complex. Gore Vidal called this permanent war for permanent peace. Housing rates, as we know, are bad. Providing affordable housing is non-existent. There's little capital investment in that area. Gun violence is well known. The world's highest rate of gun ownership and gun violence. Hunger in America, 41.2 million people are hungry, including in that there's 12.9 million kids in America are what they call food insecure. I'd call them hungry and starving. The United States estimates that it would cost the UN, estimates that it would cost $30 billion per year to end world hunger. That's about 3% of the US military budget in 2017. We know about high incarceration rates. The United States has the world's largest population of inmates and an extremely high rate of people of color in prison. So let me conclude by saying that by any standard of decency, the US political economy is not working for the majority of Americans. How can there be democracy when so many people are struggling to survive in the richest country in the world? Thank you. That's the end of my picture. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Tim.
Mm-hmm.
Great presentation.
Thank you. Thank you.